While researching Dracula, I wanted to know the why and how. Why was he Count of Transylvania? Did it have anything to do with Vlad Dracula III, also known as Vlad the Impaler? How much of it is folklore versus fantasy? Why is Dracula the most iconic of all vampires? To answer these questions, I searched papers, books, and websites until I found the best source of information: Bram Stoker's own notes for Dracula. The book, Bram Stoker's Notes for Dracula, a Facsimile Edition, annotated and transcribed by Robert Eighteen-Bisang and Elizabeth Miller, goes page by page on Bram Stoker's real notes and turns his famously scribbly handwriting into readable words. Bram Stoker himself commented on his handwriting by saying, and I quote, "I write an extremely bad hand." This translation with added annotations make this an awesome read and gives detailed insight into not only the making of Dracula, but how vampires as a whole changed to an aristocratic terror. The fascination with Gothic architecture and literature, gruesome murders, and vampire, folklore, and mythology all played a role in the birth of Dracula, Lord of the Night. Hi, my name is Brett, and this is the Fantasy Historian. For those who have not read Bram Stoker's Dracula, here is a brief summary, and as you may have guessed, spoiler alert. Jonathan Harker is a solicitor, or legal practitioner, from England that goes to meet a man named Count Dracula in his castle in Transylvania. Harker helps with paperwork and purchasing an old estate named the Carfax Estate. While there, he notices a lot of strange events and behaviors about Count Dracula. Eventually, he finds out that Count Dracula is some sort of monster and that he is locked inside the castle. After many attempts, he escapes for his life and ends up in a hospital in a state of delirium. Meanwhile, Count Dracula boards a ship and arrives in London and searches out Harker's fiancée, Mina, and her best friend, Lucy, after seeing a photo of them when Harker visits. Mina visits her fiancé, and Count Dracula bites Lucy, making her a vampire. Dr. Abraham Van Helsing is called in to figure out what illness Lucy has fallen into. Van Helsing pieces together that Lucy is a vampire and drives a stake through her. Mina then asks Van Helsing to help out with Harker's delirious state and ends up reading a journal of Harker's events in Transylvania and concludes that Count Dracula is a vampire. Dracula bites Mina, and it is a race against time to not only find Dracula, but also to save Mina. Dracula also forced Mina to drink his blood, creating a telepathic link to her. Dr. Van Helsing hypnotizes Mina, and he, Harker, and others follow the telepathic link to Dracula's home. A battle ensues between the group and Dracula's servants. Once beaten, the group finds Dracula in his coffin. He is beheaded and stabbed in the heart with a knife at the same time. Dracula turns to dust and ashes, and Mina is freed from his control and cured of vampirism.
Welcome to my house. Enter freely, and of your own will. He made no motion of stepping to meet me, but stood like a statue, as though his gesture of welcome had fixed him into stone. The instant, however, that I had stepped over the threshold, he moved impulsively forward, and holding out his hand, grasped mine with a strength which made me wince, an effect which was not lessened by the fact that it seemed as cold as ice, more like the hand of a dead than a living man. I said interrogatively, "Count Dracula?" He bowed in a courtly way as he replied, "I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in. The night air is chill, and you must need to eat and rest.
The reading of Dracula is a clip by Mike Bennett. He is an excellent reader, and I highly recommend his audio version of Dracula. I've linked his YouTube and Spotify below. Let's start with some of the most asked questions about Dracula. Why the name Dracula? Is Dracula based off of Vlad Dracula III, also known as Vlad the Impaler? Bram Stoker had a lot of difficulty finding the right name for his vampire. Through most of his notes, Bram wrote Count, and then a line that was blank. Eventually, he wrote in the name Count Wampyr, with a W and Y. The word vampire has a long etymology with different variations in meanings across different languages and cultures, and this is one of them. While this name would have drawn connections to the word, it's a little lackluster, isn't it? What solicitor, John Harker in this case, would go to visit a client with the name Count Wampyr? The mystery and rumors surrounding the Count would be obvious. I suspect that Count Wampyr is a vampire. Oh? And what makes you think that? It's in his name. Ah, fair point. Bram didn't come across the name Dracula until he found a book in the Library of Whitby titled An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia by William Wilkinson. In it, Voivode Dracula is mentioned, which refers to both Vlad Dracula II and his son, Vlad Dracula III, or Vlad the Impaler. However, the name Vlad is never mentioned, nor does it go into how Vlad Dracula II got the moniker of Dracul, or go into the life of father and son. The book was written to give the history of the region and its boundaries through time, rather than a full history of each ruler. The name Dracula is only mentioned 4 times, one of which is a footnote. Bram Stoker wrote almost word for word all these references, including the footnote in his notes, which I will read for you. Page 19. Dracula in Wallachian language means devil. Wallachians were accustomed to giving it as a surname to any person who rendered himself conspicuous by courage, cruel actions, or cunning. Pages 18 to 19. The Wallachians joined Hungarians in 1448 and made war on Turkey, being defeated at Battle of Kosovo in Bulgaria, and finding it impossible to make stand against the Turks, submitted to annual tribute which they paid until 1460, when Sultan Muhammad II, being occupied in completing conquest of islands and archipelago, gave opportunity of shaking off yoke. Their voivode, Dracula, crossed the Danube and attacked Turkish troops. Only momentary success. Muhammad drove him back to Wallachia, where pursued and defeated him. The voivode escaped into Hungary, and the Sultan caused his brother Vladis received in his place. He made a treaty with Vladis binding Wallachians to perpetual tribute and laid the foundations of that slavery not yet abolished, 1820. Some things to clarify for you. Voivode means military ruler. The note that mentions Dracula meaning devil in Wallachian is the footnote by the author, but Bram Stoker in his notes puts it at the top of his page and capitalizes all letters in both Dracula and devil, showing that he was very interested in this connection. And that's it. No other information can be gleaned from this book for Bram Stoker to write in his notes. Unless he read it somewhere else, Bram has no knowledge of the history of Vlad the Impaler. A little more insight on the name Dracul, taken from my own study on the Dracula family. Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund made Vlad Dracul II part of a chivalric order that Sigismund had created called Order of the Dragon, that was formed to defend Christianity from the Ottomans, earning him the moniker Dracul, which means dragon in Latin. This moniker was passed down to his sons. An A is added to the end of a name to signify the son of. so Drackle became Dracula. His son, Vlad Dracula III, got the name Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, because he used impalement of his enemies and their families as a fear tactic to dissuade them from taking over Wallachia. His enemies painted him as a monster to try to turn the masses against him, giving him the nickname Vlad the Impaler, which, to be fair, is very cruel indeed. To finish off this query on whether or not Bram Stoker knew of Vlad the Impaler, let's read the only mention of the historical Dracula in the book itself. Dr. Van Helsing enlightens the group by saying on page 224 of Bram Stoker's Dracula, quote,
"He must indeed have been that voivode Dracula who won his name against the Turk over the great river on the very frontier of Turkey land. If it be so, then he was no common man, for in that time, and for centuries after, he was spoken of as the cleverest and the most cunning, as well as the bravest of the sons of the land beyond the forest."
That is the only reference to the historical Dracula. He used the only notes he had on Dracula from Wilkinson's book. The part about Dracula being no common man is taken from the footnote, "Any person who rendered himself conspicuous by courage, cruel actions, or cunning is now given that surname." The Land Beyond the Forest might be a reference to Emily Gerard's The Land Beyond the Forest, which we will mention in another section. Bram Stoker was more interested in the meaning of the name, devil. Bram Stoker instead gives the history a fantastical twist on the same page. Quote,
"The Draculas were, says Arminius, a great and noble race, though now and again were scions who were held by their coevals to have had dealings with the evil one. They learned his secrets in the Scholomans amongst the mountains over Lake Hermannstadt, where the devil claims the 10th scholar as his due. In the records are such words as Stregoica, witch, Ordo, and Pokol, Satan and hell. And in one manuscript, this very Dracula is spoken of as vampire, which we all understand too well."
Scholomance was a fabled school of black magic in Transylvania, thought to be run by the devil. Bram gets to use his original name, Vampire, here, which the characters of the book know. But what about Dracula's castle then? Didn't Vlad the Impaler live in one in Transylvania? Bran Castle, found in Bran near Brasov, Transylvania, is said to be connected to Castle Dracula from Bram Stoker's novel, because it is connected to Vlad the Impaler and is located in the same area as Count Dracula's castle in the book, Transylvania. The validity of this claim, however, is up to speculation because it doesn't fit the crumbling description found in the book, and it is widely believed among scholars that Vlad never lived there. More on the castle soon. So is there a strong connection drawn by Bram Stoker between Dracula and the historical Vlad the Impaler? In my opinion, and based on his notes, I would say no. We can cross that one out. This, however, does not stop other media from drawing the connection, and we can thank Bram Stoker for initiating that. Vladimir the Blood Mage in League of Legends, the Mad Monk in the DC universe, Dracula in the Marvel universe, Matthias Cronquist, who names himself Vlad Tepes Dracula in Castlevania, to name a few. I personally love this connection made by others due to the rumor surrounding Vlad Dracula, and the way no one knows how he died, or where he is buried. Had Bram done more digging into the man himself, he may have leaned in more on the history. Before we move on to Dracula's castle, there's another element of why the name Dracula was chosen. This one is more an educated guess than a direct connection in his notes, but authors Bisang and Miller make a good point. After Bram Stoker found the name, he wrote it in one of his notes all over the top of the page, as if he was trying out the sound of it. Dracula. Count Dracula. A name holds power. A name can bring about emotions, memories, etc. When you think of the name Dracula, what do you think of? The song and Miller make a connection of having a pen name or nickname that really means something, like Jack the Ripper, which Bram Stoker lived through and was affected by. Absolutely horrific crimes were committed during this time period, and these criminals were reported as vampires by newspapers. This had less to do with the belief in vampires and more to do with the bloody actions of murderers. It also made for an attractive headline to sell papers. Among them was the serial killer Jack the Ripper, also known as the Whitechapel Murderer and Leather Apron. Whitechapel was a district in London that became overpopulated due to immigration and was incredibly poor. Violence, theft, and prostitution were a normal occurrence. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that killed 5 women by slitting their throat, disfiguring them, and removing internal organs. The manner in which Jack the Ripper killed and dissected his victims made him feared and a household name. The search for him was widespread, and the police interrogated around 300 people, only to be stumped. After the first 5 women were killed, Jack the Ripper seemed to stop and disappear forever. These women were known as the Canonical Five. More murders occurred shortly after, claiming to also be Jack the Ripper, but are widely believed to be the work of others posing as Jack the Ripper, as his signature style was not found at the scenes. The moniker Jack the Ripper came from a letter called Dear Boss, sent to the Central News Agency of London. The letter mocked the investigations and mentioned future murders. It was signed with the name Jack the Ripper. While most likely a hoax by newspapers to drum up popularity or someone posing as a serial killer, the name stuck. Bram Stoker had worked at the Lyceum Theatre in London for 10 years by the time of the Whitechapel murders in 1888. The Lyceum Theatre was producing a play from a book called The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was about a doctor by the name of Dr. Jekyll who struggled with inner demons. In order to free himself from the evil desires, Dr. Jekyll concocted a potion that allowed him to transform into the evil Mr. Hyde at will. That way, he was free of his internal struggle until he transformed. Before too long, however, he started changing into Mr. Hyde uncontrollably, and Mr. Hyde committed murder. In the end, Dr. Jekyll takes his own life and has a letter written explaining everything. People began to fear that the play was inspiring Jack the Ripper, and Bram had to shut down the theater for a time. Those that had seen the play even began to suspect that the actor, Richard Mansfield, who played Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, was actually Jack the Ripper himself, living out his performance on the dark streets of Whitechapel. When you hear the name Jack the Ripper, what do you think of? Dark alleys, foggy gaslit streets in the middle of London? Does it invoke any sense of dread? Disgust? What about Dracula? Gothic castles, blood, and evil creatures in the night? The name Dracula was a very good choice. Bram Stoker chose to keep it at the last moment, changing his book title from The Undead to Dracula, and filling in the blank after Count to Count Dracula.
Suddenly, I became conscious of the fact that the driver was in the act of pulling up the horses in the courtyard of a vast, ruined castle, from whose tall black windows came no ray of light, and whose broken battlements showed a jagged line against the moonlit sky. I must have been asleep, for certainly, if I had been fully awake, I must have noticed the approach of such a remarkable place. In the gloom, the courtyard looked of considerable size, and as several dark ways led from it under great round arches, it perhaps seemed bigger than it really is. I have not yet been able to see it by daylight. When the caleche stopped, the driver jumped down and held out his hand to assist me to alight. Again, I could not but notice his prodigious strength. His hand actually seemed like a steel vice that could have crushed mine if he had chosen. Then he took out my traps and placed them on the ground beside me as I stood close to a great door, old and studded with large iron nails and set in a projecting doorway of massive stone. I could see, even in the dim light, that the stone was massively carved, but that the carving had been much worn by time and weather. I stood in silence where I was, for I did not know what to do. Of bell or knocker there was no sign. Through these frowning walls and dark window openings, it was not likely that my voice could penetrate. The time I waited seemed endless, and I felt doubts and fears crowding upon me. What sort of place had I come to, and among what kind of people? What sort of grim adventure was it on which I had embarked?
What inspired Dracula's castle? The Victorian era, which is dated between 1837 to 1901 AD, was a very interesting period, and Bram Stoker lived right in the middle of it. The culture of the era was reflected in the literary works of the time. Victorians were enchanted by the simple and romanticized version of the medieval time period. Chivalry, castles, love stories, etc. Perhaps this was out of a desire to escape from the Industrial Revolution at the time. Perhaps it was out of boredom of the wealthy, or for the hard workers, an escape from reality. Whatever the specific reason or reasons, what became known as a Gothic revival became inseparable from vampires. So what is Gothic architecture and literature, and why has it become so crucial to modern-day vampires and fantasy? Despite having the name of Goth, the architecture and literary meaning of Gothic doesn't directly relate back to the Germanic Goths. Gothic architecture came from France in the 12th century, not the 8th century, which was the height of the Goths. While France's heritage can be traced back to a branch of the Goths called the Visigoths, which were later driven out by the Franks, no group of Goths built this way. The Catholic Church actually played a vital role in developing the style. With the purpose to inspire faith and awe, the high vaulted ceilings of Gothic cathedrals were meant to symbolize reaching up to the heavens. The large stained glass windows let in light, which is closely connected with righteousness and divinity. Together, an atmosphere of being in the midst of heavens, as it were, was created. The tall spires, flying buttresses, and pointed arches drew the eyes upward, but also were essential engineering feats that spread out the immense pressure and counterbalanced the weight of the roof into specific load-bearing points, stopping the building from folding in upon itself. The iconic gargoyles and grotesques that lined the roof were meant to ward off evil spirits. The gargoyles in particular also served to divert water away from seeping into the stones. Other buildings, like castles, took up the Gothic architecture for various reasons. During the time of the Renaissance in the 14th and 17th centuries, the architectural style was seen as an offense to classic Greek and Roman art and culture, and the term Gothic was used in disdain to represent wild and barbaric. The Goths were seen as wild and barbaric during the time of the Greeks and Romans, and were a powerful enemy to the Roman Empire. With a fixation on Greek and Roman culture, art, and philosophy, it would make sense why the term Gothic was used in a derogatory way. The Goths had actively brought down the downfall of everything the people of the Renaissance held dear and admired with the fall of the Roman Empire. Here's a question then. If Gothic architecture was supposed to bring in light and have a symbolic connection to the divine, then why does the term Gothic mean the opposite? The derogatory use of the term played a part in this, but it also came from a more practical side. These buildings were massive, and despite all the light that was brought in, there are still many recesses that have deep shadows. Soot and dirt that clung to the stone, and any partial destruction of these buildings could end up making them looking kinda creepy. But the most influential role has to do with the literature that has Gothic architecture as a main setting. With the Victorian fixation on Gothic architecture, literary works use Gothic cathedrals and castles as a setting for mystery, horror, and the supernatural. It was a perfect fit for Bram's Dracula.
My friend, welcome to the Carpathians. I am anxiously expecting you. Sleep well tonight. At 3 tomorrow, the diligence will start for Bukovina. A place on it is kept for you. At the Borgo Pass, my carriage will await you and will bring you to me. I trust that your journey from London has been a happy one, and that you will enjoy your stay in my beautiful land. Your friend, Dracula.
It is clear from his notes that Bram researched a lot about vampire folklore and mythology. Vampire myth and folklore is widespread, but a vast majority of it centers around the Slavic and Balkan regions, where the most famous vampire cases occurred, and the vampire panic spread in the 16 to 1700s. Knowing this, Bram studied the culture and the landscape of the region. While researching, Bram came across Borgo Pass, or Tehuta Pass. There were 2 books referenced that the place called Borgo Pass was discovered by Bram. Karl Bedecker's Southern Germany and Australia, including Hungary and Transylvania, written in 1887, and Charles Boner's Transylvania, Its Products and Its People, written in 1865. Mixing it with descriptions of the Carpathian mountain range, Bram created a place for Dracula's castle to reside. If we have a description and know the region, was the castle based on a real castle? Short answer, no. There are a few suggestions based upon the descriptions, but none of them have enough evidence. The reality is that Bram Stoker made it up with a mixture of history and imagination. Bisang and Miller write in their book, quote, "Although no specific castle is cited in the notes, many Dracula enthusiasts claim to have visited the castle, be it Bran Castle, or Poneri in Romania, or Slane's Castle in Cruden Bay. It is unlikely that Stoker used any particular castle as a model, for castles dot the landscapes of England and Ireland. The Castle of the King, which is one of his earliest stories, is distinguished by an illustration of a castle." Bram Stoker was born in Ireland and worked as a theatre critic for the Dublin Evening Mail. I use the word critic lightly because Bram usually wrote favorable reviews more than anything else. His reviews were well written, and his reviews were noticed by many, including famous actor Henry Irving, who was later knighted to Sir Henry Irving for his excellent acting. After writing a review praising Henry for his performance in a play of Shakespeare's Hamlet, Henry met with Bram and they became fast friends. There, Henry offered Bram a job as a business manager for the Lyceum Theatre in London that Henry owned. Bram accepted. These events are incredibly important to us in regards to the birth of Dracula, as the co-founder of the Dublin Evening Mail was none other than Sheridan Le Fanu. Sheridan Le Fanu would end up writing the vampire novella Carmela in 1872, which was influential to Bram in writing Dracula, perhaps even where the inspiration for Dr. Van Helsing and other characters came from. As business manager of the very popular Lyceum Theatre, Bram Stoker made many friends with other like-minded writers and actors. These relationships led to co-written Gothic works and inspiration for characters. The personality of Sir Henry Irving is widely believed to be where the mannerisms of Count Dracula came from. When not working or writing, Bram Stoker did a lot of reading. Amongst Bram Stoker's notes, there are many references to different research sources, but not literary works. Despite the unclear references, there are definitely some connections to earlier works that Bram was inspired from. We will take a look at two of them: John Polidori's The Vampire and Varney the Vampire by James Malcolm Rymer and Thomas Becket Prest, not only due to possible inspiration of Dracula, but because these two were the foundation that everything else was built upon. The Vampire by John Polidori, in brief, is about a vampire named Lord Ruthven, and the main character, Aubrey. Young and naive Aubrey become friends with charismatic Lord Ruthven, and together they tour Europe. While traveling, Aubrey notices suspicious and corrupt behavior of Lord Ruthven and cuts ties with him. Traveling to Greece by himself, Aubrey falls in love with an innkeeper's daughter by the name of Ianthe. While there, Ianthe tells him of a creature called a vampire, and Aubrey makes a theory that Lord Ruthven might be a vampire. One night, Ianthe is attacked and killed by a vampire who looked oddly like Lord Ruthven. Suffering from trauma, Aubrey is nursed back to health by, oh, wouldn't you know it, Lord Ruthven. How did he get there? Indebted to Lord Ruthven, Aubrey joins him once again and they travel together. While traveling, criminals jump Lord Ruthven and Aubrey. Lord Ruthven valiantly fights them off, but is mortally wounded. Before he dies, he makes Aubrey swear an oath that he tells no one of Lord Ruthven's death for a year and 1 day. Aubrey swears the oath, and Lord Ruthven dies. Returning home to London alone, lo and behold, an alive and well Lord Ruthven shows up.
Got better.
Aubrey falls into a state of hysteria and is bound to keep his oath, unable to warn anyone, including his sister, who has given her hand in marriage to Lord Ruthven. The book ends with Aubrey having a stroke, and Lord Ruthven has disappeared, leaving behind a dead and bloodless sister.
That's rough, buddy.
Finally free of his oath, Aubrey retells the story. John Polidori's story turns the walking corpse from folklore into an enchanting aristocratic vampire that has joined society. This trope was a reflection of the time period, and it caught Europe by storm when published in the New Monthly magazine in 1819. It became a cornerstone in vampire Gothic literature. One other thing that should be mentioned is that this is the first time a vampire goes for the neck. In folklore, vampires bite into the heart to drink the blood, rather than the neck. Quote taken from page 23 of The Vampire. There was no color upon her cheek, not even upon her lip. Yet there was a stillness about her face that seemed almost as attaching as the life that once dwelt there. Upon her neck and breast was blood. Upon her throat were the marks of teeth, having opened the vein. To this the men pointed, crying simultaneously, struck with horror, "A vampire! A vampire!" However, what is odd about this neck bite is that there are teeth marks, but not of the pinprick variety of the fangs of today's vampire. In fact, there are no mentions of fangs at all in the story, which actually makes it more accurate to folklore. This craze in Gothic literature affected everyone from old to young, rich to poor. Like our weekly Sunday comics in the newspaper, small weekly pamphlets that contain a chapter of an ongoing book were popular at this time. These pamphlets were sold for a penny and held the latest chapters of your favorite Gothic story. These became known as penny dreadfuls. Of particular interest, between the years 1845 to 1847, these cheap pamphlets told the story of our next vampire, Varney the Vampire, or otherwise known as The Feast of Blood, by James Malcolm Rymer and Thomas Becket Prest. Even though this story was sold in small installments, Collectively put together, it holds a total of 232 chapters and is 876 pages long. Let's read it together. Just kidding. If you do want to listen to an audio version or read the book, I have put the links in the description. The Feast of Blood centers around a vampire named Sir Francis Varney, set in the Victorian era. Varney's adventures take him to different locations, including London, Bath, Winchester, Naples, and Venice. Varney preys upon a wealthy family by the name of Bannerworth. The family, terrified and angry from the attacks, search to identify the attacker. The story goes on to talk about the conflict between Varney and the family, their battles and discovery. While not explicitly mentioned, Varney's motivation is a mixture between needing to feed and money, with a possible inference of Varney being a past ancestor of the Bannerworth family that is somehow a vampire. As the story progresses, the authors give us a deeper look into Varney's history, showing us what is called a sympathetic vampire. Looking less like a monster and more like a person condemned with a curse, Varney tries to take his life multiple times, but just gets healed back to life in moonlight. The story ends with Varney throwing himself into Mount Vesuvius, where he can no longer regenerate. The Feast of Blood is an important milestone in Gothic vampire literature, and inspires many other works, not just Dracula. Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire has a sympathetic vampire. Marvel Universe uses a variation in spelling of the name Varney, as its first and oldest vampire created by the inhabitants of Atlantis before it sank. Vlad Dracula drinks his blood, turning him into a powerful vampire. The anime series Castlevania, made by Konami, features the Grim Reaper, disguised as Varney, trying to bring back Dracula. The inspiration Varney the vampire has on Dracula is where we have particular interest. The authors are the first to create the modern-day vampire that we see today in fantasy. The figure turns half round, and the light falls upon its face. It is perfectly white, perfectly bloodless. The eyes look like polished tin. The lips are drawn back, and the principal feature next to those dreadful eyes is the teeth. The fearful-looking teeth, projecting like those of some wild animal, hideously, glaringly white and fang-like. It approaches the bed with a strange, gliding movement. With a plunge, he seizes her neck in his fang-like teeth, and a gush of blood and a hideous sucking noise follows. But she showed upon her neck the marks of 2 teeth, and there was a small wound on which, even in the morning, was a little portion of coagulated blood. Once again, taking a quote from Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula, Facsimile Edition, the authors write, "Many passages have a familiar ring. Mixed reactions of desire and fear, sleepwalking, the ways of destroying vampires, the vampire hunt, a midnight vigil at the tomb of a suspected vampire, a vampire transforming into a wolf, and a chase to the vampire's resting place. All of these features become permanent fixtures of the literary vampire after Bram Stoker used them in his novel." Page 311. End quote. If Varney the vampire is so important, why is it overshadowed by Dracula? Well, it has some issues. Because the authors were getting paid for each issue published, it is incredibly long and convoluted. Branching plots, inconsistencies, and contradictions that make you wonder if Varney really is a vampire or not. While containing many firsts in the vampire genre, its confusing nature has most people only using it as a reference. There is something eerily ironic about the people of this era being obsessed with penny dreadfuls. They were fascinated in the scary Gothic literature about death, but all they had to do was look at the death residing in the popular green wallpaper of their own homes that used arsenic, and the gruesome vicious murders that plagued the city. There are many other works that may have been an inspiration of Bram Stoker, like Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, and the epistolary writing style from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but I want to move on to our last section. Bram Stoker was bedridden from an unknown illness until the age of 7. His mother told stories to him of the cholera epidemic from 1834 and other scary stories of Irish folklore: pixies, shapeshifters, banshees, changelings. From there, his love for scary stories grew. While influential literary works aren't specifically mentioned, his research into myth and folklore was. Bram was heavily inspired by Emily Gerard's article Transylvanian Superstitions and The Book of Werewolves by Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. Emily Gerard later revises the article in her book The Land Beyond the Forest, which we saw in an earlier quote. Bram Stoker also looked at historical vampire cases. The New England case of Mary Brown in particular is mentioned in his notes, and vaguely in Dracula. A newspaper clipping was kept in his notebook. Equipped with the knowledge of myth and folklore, Bram begins to write Dracula.
Within stood a tall old man, clean-shaven save for a long white moustache, and clad in black from head to foot, without a single speck of colour about him anywhere. His face was a very strong, aquiline, with high bridge of the thin nose and peculiarly arched nostrils, with lofty, domed forehead and hair growing scantily round the temples, but profusely elsewhere. His eyebrows were very massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. The mouth, so far as I could see it under the heavy moustache, was fixed and rather cruel-looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over his lips, whose remarkable ruddiness showed astonishing vitality in a man for his years. For the rest, his ears were pale, and at the tops extremely pointed. The chin was broad and strong, and the cheeks firm, though thin. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor.
For the sake of time, I will be brief. Bram Stoker took the corpses of myth and folklore and created a gentleman with a dark and mysterious side, from many different vampires to one Lord of the Night villain. Bram used just enough stories from history, mixed together with creativity, imagination, and inspiration to keep the essence of a vampire without straying too far. I think one of the features that make fantasy vampires so loved is that they are relatable in a sense. They look and act like humans, but more lies beneath the surface. Count Dracula passes for a normal human being until his behavior reveals his true self. I cannot express enough how important this book is to the modern-day vampire. The amount of not only vampire spin-offs, but Dracula variations are astounding. Nosferatu, Count von Count, Van Helsing, Hotel Transylvania, Count Chocula, Castlevania, DC Marvel Universes, Innistrad and Magic the Gathering, Vampire the Masquerade tabletop RPG, and the list goes on. Bram Stoker's novel opened a whole new world of aristocratic vampires to explore. Bisang and Miller write on page 291, quote, "Explanations and apologies for the novel's appeal have concentrated on a plethora of psychosexual interpretations, the changing mores of Victorian England, the historical Vlad the Impaler, and numerous other themes. But Dracula is more than a horror novel with elements of mystery, romance, and eroticism. A deeper level of meaning is embedded in the text. As James B. Twitchell remarks, Dracula's claim on our attention is not its historical importance or its artistic merit, that its power is derived from something below the surface, something carried within the myth itself. Dracula is the consummate retelling of the vampire story. All the pieces are used, and all the pieces fit." End quote. I ran into the same thing while looking at studies on Dracula, and his own notes held the answers I was looking for. I hope you all enjoyed this inside look into the mind of Bram Stoker and the birth of arguably one of the greatest vampires in Gothic literature. I'll see you in the next one.